All right, good morning, Chair Postman, members Garrett, Vollendroff, staff, and guests. The lobbies are open. Recording has begun.
Thanks, Justin. Good morning, everybody. We'll convene the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board meeting for January 17th, 2024. Our first item is a piece of expedited rulemaking. This is for board adoption of CR 105 for the engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5365 regarding increased penalties for selling tobacco and vapor products. And Denise Laflamme will present the item to us. Good morning.
Morning. Morning, Chair Postman, board members Garrett and Vollendroff, and LCB staff. This morning, I'm presenting for approval a CR 105 for expedited rulemaking that implements the penalties portion of engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5365 from the 2023 legislative session. Specifically, the new law increases penalties the LCB may impose under RCW 70-155-100 for violations of licensed retailers who sell tobacco and vapor products to persons under the age of 21. There are a series of penalty increases for the first through fourth violations outlined in WAC 314-35-075 table. There's a penalties table. The penalty for the first violation in a 3-year period increases from $200 to $1,000. The penalty for the second violation within a 3-year period increases from $600 to $2,500. The penalty for the third violation in a 3-year window increases from $2,000 to $5,000. And the penalty for the fourth violation increases from $3,000 to $10,000. Other parts of a gross substitute Senate Bill 5365 around LCB enforcement and education have already been implemented. Because these changes are required by statute, meaning we have to make these rule changes, and we have to change the rules exactly as the bill required, we don't need to use our traditional rulemaking process, which would take much longer. Instead, we are doing what is called expedited rulemaking, which means the CR 105, if approved today, is published for 45 days, and there is an opportunity for objection. If we receive no objections for 45 days, meaning by March 26th, then we can proceed with filing the CR 103 for final adoption of the rule, which would be during the March 27th board meeting. If we do receive an objection, which is not withdrawn by the end of the 45-day period, we will unfortunately be required to do this all through the standard rulemaking process of filing a CR 101, having a public hearing, etc. But I don't anticipate we will need to do that. Based on this, I'm requesting approval today of the CR 105 for expedited rulemaking regarding implementation of increased penalties from engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5365. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
One quick one, just for my own clarity. When we're not actually writing rules, we're just taking what was passed by the legislature and putting it into rule, right?
And amending the rule table and just increasing these numbers. Actually, it's increasing a separate row, but it's just putting straight in there.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Any other questions? No. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. I think it's great we're doing it. Glad to see the penalties going up like that. So we will entertain a motion for adoption of the CR 105 for expedited rules for engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5365 regarding increased penalties for selling tobacco and vapor products to persons under the age of 21.
I'd move that we adopt.
Okay.
This is Jim, and I second that.
Great. Then that is approved. Thank you all. And now we are going to move to a public hearing on rules regarding substitute Senate Bill 5448 and Mass 13 permits. And Daniel Jacobs will present that for us. Morning, Mr. Jacobs.
Good morning, Chair Postman, members Garrett, Vollendroff, LCB staff, members of the public. This morning, I'm going to preview the public hearing on substitute Senate Bill 5448 or alcohol delivery, Mass 13 rulemaking. Just as some brief background, 5448 extended some of the privileges and allowances made during the COVID-19 pandemic for liquor licensees, making others permanent part of law and rescinding others. The CR 101 was filed in July and 2 stakeholder engagement sessions held in October after draft rule language was released. We received some comments on the draft rule language from the Washington Wine Institute. Those comments were attached to the CR 102 memo filed back in December. CR 102 and proposed rules were filed on December 6th, and we've received a few comments since then, all of which in support of the Mass 13 part of the rules. We additionally received a set of comments yesterday from the Wine Institute, and to my knowledge, those comments are going to be testified about during this public hearing. The Mass 13 rule project was initiated after the board accepted a petition to make a different pandemic allowance a permanent part of rule. Mass 13 permit holders currently are allowed to pour beer and wine at the customer's table, and during the pandemic, the LCB issued an allowance to let these folks pour away from the table. This allowance expired in September 2022, and a petition for rulemaking was shortly thereafter submitted to make this permanent. The board accepted this petition in January 2023. Following the end of the legislative session for 2023 and passage of 5448, the 2 rule projects were combined. The rule changes proposed in these rules fall into 5 broad categories. The first is adding references to the new alcohol delivery statute. The second is distinguishing some of the takeout and delivery requirements related to this statute and distinguishing those from other pre-existing takeout and delivery rules. The third is on ready-to-drink cocktails. The fourth is on consolidating and some very slight tweaks to outdoor service rules. And the fifth is on the Mass 13 rule changes. Regarding the first change, RCW 6624-710 codified several requirements that were already in many of the rules being amended, such as requiring a complete meal to accompany any alcohol sales, that delivery drivers hold Mass 12 permits, and some other requirements. Where these requirements were already in rule, we simply added a citation to this RCW, and where they weren't in rule, we added in those requirements. Secondly, some licensees identified in RCW 6624-710 could already sell alcohol through takeout via other endorsements and in some instances based on their enabling statute. Thus, this created some confusion because these licensees now had the ability to take alcohol through takeout and delivery, but under 2 different endorsements and through 2 different sets of rules. To clarify this, some rule language was removed to make clear which rules applied to which endorsements, as well as a new rule created in what will be WAC 314-03-600, which is a table that explains whether or not a meal is required and whether or not third-party delivery prohibited, depending on the type of license that the liquor licensee holds, as well as the type of endorsement or privilege at issue. Third is ready-to-drink cocktails, which, as you all know, are increasingly popular, and these have become the subject of frequent questions to agency staff just about which sets of rules apply to them. Being able to address some of these questions regarding the delivery context involved clearly stating which rules apply and providing a proposed definition for what constitutes a ready-to-drink cocktail. The fourth set of changes is about outdoor service rules. And currently there are 2 different outdoor service rules, which has created a lot of confusion because agency staff and licensees have to look at 2 different rules that cover the same topic. The reason for this is because the second rule was created during the pandemic to address some expanded allowances to allow businesses to continue operating while complying with various government requirements about limits on who could be indoors. 5448 made these temporary exception rules permanent. And so then we had 2 different permanent rules. To streamline this, we proposed consolidating these 2 permanent rules into 1 permanent rule. Some of the suggested edits from stakeholders didn't make their way into the proposed rule. That's because for the most part, we've tried to keep the outdoor service rule as similar as possible to the 2 existing rules. And we're already making a lot of changes with this rule package. We We didn't want to go into sort of upending the outdoor service rules writ large. One change that we did make was adding catered events as a category of instance where permanent movable barriers are required versus a fence-free permanent demarcation. And this refers to where, depending on where the outdoor service area is, sometimes the licensee will need to have like a fence or a movable fence, and sometimes they can sort of have a dotted line or some kind of dotted line on the ground to sort of indicate where their premises ends and where something else begins. We added these catered events based on agency staff input. However, the food service requirement for outdoor service areas, those have not been changed by the proposed rules, and we're not proposing to change those. The last thing is the Mass 13 rule changes. We're just proposing to make the allowance that I talked about earlier permanent. I mentioned during the CR 102 presentation that there's been some internal agency concern about this rule change from a policy perspective. I went into more detail about this, during the 102, and I can talk about it again after the public hearing, but those concerns remain. Agency staff there's still agency staff here who remain opposed to these rule changes, and that position hasn't changed. With that, I believe we're ready to proceed with the public hearing. While we typically don't answer questions during the public hearing, if there's a question that comes up, I'll be happy to answer any questions from board members after we've concluded the public hearing and before the board meeting ends today. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Stand by. With that, then we'll open the public hearing regarding the rules on substitute Senate Bill 5448 and the Mass 13 permits. I have one person signed up, Josh McDonald. Morning.
Good morning. All right. Good morning, Chair Postman, Chair Members Garrett and Volendroff. Thank you so much for an opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Josh McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Wine Institute. And I will first want to thank Daniel and his staff's great work so far on this CR 101, CR 102, and being able to be very open and engaging with us and working with us and talking to us throughout the process. You can divide my comments into two sections, one around outdoor service rules and one around Mass 13. This is where our focus was as stakeholders during the 2023 legislative process that helped work 5448 through the process to into law. These parts of these outdoor service parts are very important to us. So we want to focus down on that. There's some things we think can continue to be worked on during that. We also want to thank LCB policy staff, licensee staff, the board for meeting with us, taking time to walk through our comments, our suggestions, our ways we think we can improve this. We hope that work can continue. First, on the outdoor service rules, we agree consolidating to one WAC is a great move. So we have one thing to look at. So thank you for doing that and applying to all on-premise licensees. To that point, we think there could be an easy technical fix here to make sure for future interpretations of this WAC, it's not confusing for both licensees and enforcement and licensing itself. And that's around making sure that when we talk about food service, that we're recognizing what the licensee is required to do. So not all licensees are required to serve food. So making sure that the WACs reflect that. So all on-premise licensees in the future, there's no confusion on interpretation of that. I want to thank staff and others for coming through with some, I think, really good solutions on that. One is looking at it from a technical fix of if your license requires you to serve food, then food service is required in indoors and outdoors. That means if food is not required of your license, it's very simple and straightforward. I think we can all understand the change there. And if you're a winery or brewery that doesn't require it, it's your option. You're still welcome to use outdoor service areas in this way. If you are licensed at a restaurant, you already know you have food requirements. It fits really well. So we think that's a great solution to this. And thanks staff and all for working with us on that. We hope we can implement that into this when it goes into CR 103. Second is we do strongly believe, we think this is an great opportunity to streamline how we look at public space versus private space when it comes to outdoor service areas. Right now, there are two different sets of standards of what's allowed to be done in a privately owned or leased area of outdoor service versus a publicly owned indoor outdoor service. Based on limited time, I'm happy offline to talk about the history of that, but what I'll say why that happened to where we are today. But I do think there's a great opportunity to bring those together, make it very simple, give the same set of opportunities for whether it's your own private space or it's space you're on a public setting, whether you want to use barriers, whether you want to use movable barriers, or whether you want to use demarcations, demarcate your space where you're going to serve. I think any of those options for licensees is flexible. It helps small businesses. It helps us be able to continue to be successful in our spaces, but I think it also streamlines how licensing enforcement can look at our space and say, okay, we know that this is your space, this is your service space. However you want to identify that, it's up to the licensee to do that. We'll work with you on that to make sure it makes sense. But we think the option there is a modernizing way to look at it, but also honestly more of a technical fix to this, bringing it together, and something that we hope can be incorporated into as we move towards the CO 103. And again, we would love to work with everyone on that, getting to that conclusion.
Josh, you have 30 seconds.
Finally, on Mass 13, I just want to say a very big thank you. I know we brought this forward and we've been working with the board and staff on these changes, very positive changes to allow for our Mass 13 holders to be able to do a few more things like they did in the pandemic. Zero violations, zero concerns that we hear from all around. So we think we've handled those responsibilities very well, and we look forward to it moving in 103 with the language intact. And we think it's a great win-win solution. With that, thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Quick question then, Mr. Jacobs. I know you've heard these concerns, and these are and I, so there's some things we can change between now and the 103, and others that would require refiling. Do you see these technical fixes as something that'll be adopted into this version? Have you reached those conclusions yet?
I have. Would we be able to conclude the public hearing and then I can answer
sorry.
that
Yes,
question?
It is actually. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, with that, we'll conclude the public hearing. Mr. Jacobs.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, that just a.
I know.
just
No, it's good.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
technical.
So some of those changes, yes. The issue is, so specifically regarding the, as Mr. McDonald said, currently there's two sets of rules for if the outside service area is in a public space or a private space. And really the way to think about it is during the pandemic, when restaurants had their outdoor service area like on the sidewalk or kind of on the sidewalk versus if it's just like in their parking lot. So right now the rules basically are if it's on the sidewalk, more subject to accept a few exceptions, there has to be a physical barrier versus if it's in the parking lot, you can use a demarcation. The proposal here from the Wine Institute is to have one set of rules for both. I actually might have switched it. I think it's the other way around. I think it's that if it's with the public area, you could use the demarcation, and if it's private area, you have to use the fence. So there's one set of rules for the public spaces and one set of rules for the private spaces. Those aren't currently in the proposed rules for the 102. If we were to add that in, I think there's a good chance that would require us to file a supplemental CR 102, which, as I talked about yesterday, would push out the timeline quite a bit. The changes about the language for the food service to making it a conditional language, I think that we can probably do without needing a supplemental 102 because we're not changing really the rule requirements. We're just changing the wording to make it clear. Because right now the wording says whatever food you have to serve inside, you also have to serve outside. And their proposal is to say, well, why don't we just reword it as an if-then conditional? Like if you need to serve food outside, then you also need to serve that same, or if you need to serve food inside, then you also need to serve that same food outside. And similarly, if you don't meet the condition precedent, then you don't have the if, then there's no then. So I would think that sort of the requirement wouldn't change, but I would think because we currently have two different sets of rules for public versus private spaces, to change that at this stage, I think that I would probably need to consult with our friends at the AG next to you a little more, but I think that there's a decent chance that might trigger the need for a supplemental 102, which, as I mentioned yesterday, would push out the rules from being in effect at the beginning of March to the end of April.
Well, I was trying to keep track yesterday when you're talking about the potential delays overall. So implementation would come 30 days later than if we didn't refile? Or that's just for refiling and then kicks it out even further for final action?
Well, it would kick it out even further because we only present filings every 2 weeks during the board meetings, but the code reviser's calendar works differently. The code reviser's calendar has 2 publication dates a month, which don't always line up with our board meetings. And so, for example, if we filed something today, it wouldn't get published till next week. And because we can't have public hearings until at least 30 days after the publication date, if we ended up having to do a 102 on the 31st, it wouldn't get published till Valentine's Day, which means then we couldn't have the public hearing until mid-March. And so it would push it out more than 30 days as a short answer to your question. It would push it out closer to between 45 and 60 days.
Right. Okay. Great. Any other questions for Mr. Jacobs on this?
I would just make a comment that I would support us checking in with the AG's office on this and exploring it a little further.
Yeah, I think we should definitely do that as part of this next phase. Let's ask those questions, which I'm sure you will. So, okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that, Mr. Jacobs.
All right, thanks so much.
That brings us to general public comment. This is where everybody who signs up before the meeting has a chance to speak for up to 4 minutes. We ask people to limit their comments as much as possible to LC business, refrain from personal attacks, of course, or going too far off topic. I'll mention if I think somebody has wandered too far. Ask everybody in the room and online in any way to be respectful of each other, to those speaking and those listening. If there's any disruptions, we'll just pause until we can clear that. Remember, in the room here, microphone's very sensitive, picks up every little noise. So take any conversations out into the hallway. We have few people signed up online. As always, just give us a second to connect you and we'll do so. And then for everybody, you get 4 minutes. When you have 30 seconds left, Dustin will politely remind you of that. And then we'll ask you to finish up right at the end of that time period. So with that, we'll start with those signed up online. And the first person is Sean Dene.
Can you hear me now?
I sure can. Good morning.
I'm not sure if my camera works or not. Oh, there I go. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been a while since I've spoken to y'all. I'm Sean Dene, wagon seller, co-owner of Washington Bud Company. We're a 2,000 square foot grow up in Snohomish County. And we are the first company to have voluntarily tested our crops for both pesticides and heavy metals beginning in 2016 when we got our license. And I'm really concerned about a statement that Mr. Webster made in December to the Regulated Substance and Gaming Committee. He went over, and this is a quote, 3 different pathways for cannabis testing. 2 of them are initiated by us, and 1 of them is initiated by the licensee. First is the ongoing standard periodic testing, looking at products that say they're pesticide-free. Are they actually pesticide-free? Second, are complaints or investigation-driven testing, where somebody say, hey, there's something on this particular product. Both of these pathways involve sending samples to the WSDA lab in Yakima. Third, there's a routine test that all producer processors have to do to ensure their products are safe, using one of the 8 accredited private labs. So there is a group of us that our reputations are based on providing clean cannabis. And me and my friends in that category feel like we're being pestered, like we're being targeted. And let me give you an example. On September 15th of 2020, 5 samples were taken by our compliance. Well, at that time, they were enforcement officers. It took until February 7th of 2021 for the results to come back to us. They were far below the action levels. So we know action levels are 0.1. They found things at 0.0018, 0.0048, 0.0031. And these are things that, are found that states spray in the ditches. I mean, they're herbicides, so they're not anything that any grower would put on our plants because they would kill them in any sort of, volume. Anyway, so even though they were way below the action limits, the officers still made us remediate. So we had to find a lab that could test our soil, that could test our nutrients. And so there's all sorts of different nutrients. I mean, those are multiple tests. Test our water. Those tests could not duplicate those small detection levels. But yet we had to spend over $2,500 to retest this product. At that time in February, a second round of samples were taken. And this was from tested material. So this was in February, second round taken. In November of 23, the compliance officer shared that there was a pesticide that showed it over 0.1 action level. Now, this is on a product that was already QA sampled and non-detect I have a test that shows non-detect, but the WSD lab detected it, right? It's slightly over the action level. That's where my test says non-detect. Whose test prevails in that instance? The compliance officer didn't know. So it was easier to recall
Dylan, you have 30
the
seconds.
product that was out there than it was to debate this at the time. Another round of samples was taken in November, and now we're waiting for that. So we're in the cycle. We're being systematically cycled through. The second thing that I wanted to ask you all about is we know that there are millions of dollars set aside for the social equity applicants. They're having a really hard time accessing that, going to Department of Commerce, going to the LCB. I'd really like to ask the LCB to take leadership on this and make that happen for those folks. Okay, thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, staff was listening, Sean, and we'll get follow up on your questions there. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Christopher King.
Great morning.
Good morning.
Today's magic word is HIPAA. Two magic words, HIPAA violation. Let's get straight to it because the work of a journalist is never done. You know that, Mr. Postman. So, and as for you, Attorney Patel, I remember when I was a state lawyer, it's funny because life is pretty easy. You just say something and the courts give you whatever you want. But anyway, you're not going to be able to cover this one up, sir. We have a situation here with Co-op 138 that I found out about. And they are on their way now to the courthouse to sue you and other actors. And I'll tell you why. You want to know why, right? Anyway, listen. What it is they had a hearing scheduled. All right. Hold on a minute. They had a hearing scheduled for, I want to say it was, I forget the particular date, but there was a hearing scheduled because, these people were award-winning. It was an award-winning shop, okay? And what this shop had done, they were award-winning collective. And what the issue is that your people had a hearing set with this guy, with the Co-op 138 on a certain date, okay? And what happened was the Detective Frank Black wrote in, and he writes to WLCB and he says, hey, we have a complaint about a medical grow from Anacortes PD. The location is blah, 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 right? And your staff writes back, okay? Your staff writes back and says, oh, the address was associated with the cooperative registration. It says basically, starts discussing license number 412691 and says, in summary, the location and the people identified do not hold a valid marijuana license or cooperative registration at this time, okay? Well, the problem is several-fold with that. That information should not have been distributed by an LCB staffer. That should have come through the SAW portal, okay? Pursuant to RCW 4256-520, all right? So that's a HIPAA violation straight off the bat. But to make matters worse, that's the wrong number. The right number is 428651, okay? So based off the information that LCB illegally distributed in the first place, Frank Black and his cohorts out there at the Skagit County Task Force, the inner whatever they raid these people the day before they had a hearing scheduled with the LCB as to the legitimacy of their facility, okay? And they just wrecked them. And so you have a problem here because not only was the information leaked improperly, shared without authorization, it was shared, with the improper entity identified. And based on this information, my friends got raided and shut down. Okay, it's a false and inaccurate report. Furthermore, because the person Shannon Angel, marijuana licensing supervisor, she's basically testifying for the ultimate issue at hand for the hearing, which is whether or not their cooperative was legit. And the cooperative had been legit forever, and they had awards from PSE for their work in the community and all that stuff, treating cancer patients and all that stuff, medical cannabis, medical marijuana, and all that.
30 seconds.
All right. And so now you had one of your recreational shops move in within a certain radius, and they had to demonstrate that they had a basis to continue, which they could have done by showing residency and all that. But the bottom line is this: another attack by the LCB, an agency nobody can trust, and you're caught. There are no two ways around this one. I'm looking into your soul right now, Mr. Postman, as a board member, all of you. I'm looking at your soul, and I'm telling you, I got you this time. Goodbye.
We'll move to those that are signed up in the room now. First up is Peter Manning.
Good morning, Postman Chair, Board Member Ali Garrett, and Valendroff, Board Member Valendroff. My name is Peter Manning. Currently, I'm the president of Black Excellence Cannabis. This organization was formed, I would say, in theory, in 2015, came into fruition early 2016, and here we are today. And this organization was created because of the lack of inclusion of the Black and Brown community in the cannabis industry. But I would like to say, let me just follow my notes. I had to put this disclaimer out there. We were not responsible for some depiction of Ali Garrett with Inslee that did not come from Black Excellence Cannabis. Aaron Barfield does not represent our organization in any way, nor are we affiliated with him. And we would not attack anyone's personal likes, dislikes, or characteristics based off their person. We attack policies that we do not agree with that affect our community. We are solution-based, further and foremost. I have to clear that up. My question to the board today is, we understand that 2870 came off. A lot of people aren't happy with it, me being one. But those that did get through, there's a lack of funding out there. We understand that the funding was supposed to be available at the time that they received the congratulation letter. This is not come to fruition. We need to know why. The lack of funding for this program further divides the chances for those Black and Brown community members that did receive an application of approval. It divides the landscape even further because the white ownership still profits and benefits to this day, even stronger. Now they're currently trying to get bills passed in the House or the Senate to bring in out-of-state investment, would make these social equity licenses useless. We need to get this program moving, Mr. Postman. Bob Ferguson made a statement last week on Twitter. He said that transparency, a fair and competitive marketplace benefits consumers and businesses. If you're listening, Mr. Ferguson, our future governor, what is going on with this LCB and the social equity licensing? What has been going on since the early 2015? Currently, we are still, and I'm telling you, I'm a person that's been fighting since 2014. It's documented. And there's not one store in Seattle that's Black owned. And I mean, goddamn, excuse my language, we got to change this, man. And it's like everybody slow walks this process right when it's coming to fruition. What's up with that? Why is it that we can, I looked at I-502, I looked at how fast that worked. There were special there was special everything about making that program get to the, get in the process expeditiously. But when it comes to Blacks and brown people with social equity, it is the slowest pace, slowest walking institution or program I've ever seen. And I just don't understand why. With that being said, Board Postman, please
Peter, you have 30 seconds.
let us in our community know what's up. We need to hear from you on what's going on with the funding. Thank you.
Next person signed up is Mike Sy.
Good morning, Chair Postman, board members Garrett Valendroff. My name is Mike Kasai, founder of Emerald City Collective, first downtown Seattle medical cannabis dispensary, 2010, unjustly shut down by the city of Seattle, LCB. I'm also the vice president of Black Excellence of Cannabis, fighting for inclusion. I don't want to repeat everything Mr. Manning said, but it is going on 4 years since the passage of 2870, and not one license that's opened up, only certificate holders. Certificate holders, they're not social equity licensees. They already had a license. They did not need the rubric points. They simply needed to qualify for 2 of the 3 qualifications. This gave them a year head start to find a location, prepare to open up once a third-party vendor completed the review. The few medical cannabis pioneers who were awarded a license had no certainty, like myself, that they would get across the finish line. How could a pioneer afford to obtain a location months in advance without confirmation they would get a license? Where's the grant funds to complete this licensing process? Going on 8 years since the hijacking of medical cannabis, causing patients to resort back to the non-recreational market, the Black and brown community does not trust or want to be exposed by the Department of Health, the database. Many of the current lottery license winners did not want to provide medical cannabis. They were completely against providing medical cannabis and suggested 2 different types of licenses, so they would not have to worry about medical cannabis community. But yet these same retailers have multiple locations based off medical cannabis pioneers who had brick and mortar locations, who did the right thing by getting licensed and paying taxes prior to 2013. Many of these overly qualified pioneers were shut out, like myself. 8 years, still no African-American owned cannabis locations in Seattle or Dr. Junior King County. This was not a mistake or an oversight. This was intentional. Social equity programs across the nation are facing lawsuits, and why? Washington State would never have to create a social equity bill if simply the Black and brown pioneers were not unjustly shut out. What this agency did in 2017 was not just wrong, but it was criminal. Senate Bill 5131 was like a thief in the night. Taking away the merit-based language given medical pioneers first priority was not because the medical needs were satisfied, but it was for those current white retailers to monopolize the industry, while myself and many other pioneers were cut out and holding out hope to get a license. Many Black and brown and white patients did not want to sign up for the Department of Health database. LCB manipulated the state legislators in 2015 and 2017, using false data to hijack the cannabis industry, getting rid of the language in the law and adding new language which gave those retailers ownership from 3 to 5 licenses. My message, our message, Black Excellence in Cannabis, to Governor Inslee, who signed these bills into law in 2015 and 2017. I don't know you personally, Governor, but I believe you to be a genuine person. There has been years of talk about social equity and justice for the African-American community, descendants of slavery. With some action, but not the action that is needed the past 4 years and today. We are speaking up for social equity licensees who obtain the preliminary letters of approval. My message to social equity licensees: don't be afraid to speak up. Nothing will happen to you. Your voice matters. Feel free to reach out to us at info@blackexcellencecannabis.org. And lastly, I have to say this. This agency knew about Ben Sears in 2018. To sit up there and say you didn't know about Ben Sears,
Mike, that's your time.
Is a lie. This agency knew about it. It's documented. Thank you.
Next person signed up is Gregory Foster.
Good morning, Chair, board members, folks in the room and online. My name is Gregory Foster with Cannabis Observer, and I'm here to follow up on my comments from the last board meeting about the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, or WISIP, study on licensed non-medical cannabis retail access and high school outcomes in Washington State. I followed up and spoke with the lead researcher over at WISIP, and we talked for like an hour and a half. It's a really good conversation. And talked about the overall benefit cost evaluation, the limitations that they were under, challenges with historical reports. And so I'm here to ask LCB to help with the process of gathering a couple of particular data sets that would be of use to WISIP and to the larger research community in general. Those pertain to tribal retail operations and to ban and moratoria jurisdictions. So in the conversation about this particular most recent study, the hypothesis that they had was that high school outcomes would be affected by proximity to retailers, from the sense that there's a possibility of an increased probability that family or older friends might have easier access to cannabis and provide that to underage persons. She specifically said they're not assuming that kids are buying from licensed retailers. So I asked about how those particular questions are selected for research, and it's based on kind of the overall mandate criteria, how it would assist this 2-decade benefit cost analysis, availability of data, and contemporary stakeholder interest. But that availability of data was the most important one. And so in those conversations, the limitations of the study were reviewed, which included that they don't have reliable data on, probably most importantly, underage access to impairing hemp products in conventional retail settings or online and mail order. No consideration of that at all in the studies or in any of the historical studies. They didn't account for the ban and moratoria areas, and they didn't account for the presence of cannabis retail operations in tribal nations, in compacted tribal nations. So, and it's my understanding that no published academic research around cannabis in Washington State accounts for those things, which is, well, let's fix that. So a tribal retail database, well, I don't mean to make work for Ms. Conwell, who I know is on the call, but it would not be too much trouble for us to track the locations of tribal retail operations and when they began operations, or began or ended operations as well. Same with the ban and moratoria database. We undertook efforts to, within the licensing division, to identify ban and moratoria areas for the social equity program. So we have the start on that data. And so wrapping all this up,
Greg, you have 30 seconds.
There is HB 2182, which is asking the agency to make a data dashboard with extensive new data publicly available, which the agency supported. And thank you, Mr. Webster, for going on record and saying that the agency is enthusiastic about building that platform. These would be some good data sets to add. Thanks for your time.
Can you email me what the data sets you're specifying, and we'll pass that on? And yeah, thank you. Okay, that's all we have signed up today. So we will adjourn the board meeting for today. We'll be back Tuesday for caucus. We're adjourned. And I think they are coming in. We're going to have to sit in.
Good.